G'day Internet, and welcome back to a slightly belated video. This time around we're going to have a look at this Amstrad CPC 464. Now this machine actually for the most part works. It came from a lot that myself and a mate Ingmar picked up a little while ago. It was a lot of 4 and we basically just hoped we'd get 2 working machines out of it. And we did. He got a working one and I got a working one. The original faults with this was a dead CPU and a wonky PLA socket, which I was quite relieved about, because if it was an actual dead PLA then I'm not sure where I was going to source another one here in Australia. But it's not without fault. A, it's filthy dirty. The keyboard is, well, shall we say, crunchy, and the tape deck has got some issues. Now I've done the belts in the tape deck, but the idler pulley needs replacing, and I'm waiting on parts, so we're not going to get to that today because we all know what international shipping is like. So we'll start by pulling the thing to pieces and basically just giving it a thorough good clean. And then I've also got a DDI, which is the disk drive interface, and an FD1 to look at. So let's get to it. So here is the Amstrad in all its filthy glory. So we'll start by pulling the cover off. Now you've got to be careful when you disassemble these because you need to lift it up slightly, remove the cable for the cassette and the power switch, and then lift it up on its end and remove the ribbon cables for the keyboard. So that's that. I've actually already had the screws out of this because I've been working and playing with it, trying to work out what I'm going to do. So that is the entire computer. That is the motherboard there. And that is the incredibly filthy bottom case. So let's just take a quick look at the motherboard. So here it is. There's a lot of custom chips, RAM, PLA, processor. But for the main part we're concerned about is, it is disgusting. So this here is also going to get a thorough cleaning as well. The last thing we have to pull apart is, if I get rid of some of these pieces. So next we want to take a look at the top half of the machine, so the keyboard and the tape deck. So we'll flip it over and we'll start by removing the keyboard. And we've got to remember this one here's got the little twist tie looking thing on it. And in theory the keyboard should now just lift out, and we need to disconnect the earth strap. So that's the keyboard, complete with its dust bunnies. Now the tape deck. The tape deck is a little tricky because you've actually got to remove these first. So, all right, that's the volume control, power switch, and now the actual tape deck. And we'll start in this corner primarily because there is another little earth strap between it and the power cable, so that needs to slide out. So that's those 2 loose. Bottom screw here. Top screw there. Now there's 2 tricky ones. One is buried right down in the guts here, which I kind of got to just feel around for and hope it comes out. It does. And there's one here kind of buried amongst the cables. Right, and in theory, oh wait a minute, there's the LED, and the LED can be tricky because it's kind of clipped in and you need to get a fingernail or something underneath it and then lever it out. Come on, come on. There we go. And in theory, this should all now just lift out. What have I forgotten? Speaker. The speaker just slides in. So that's that out. While we're at it, let's remove this screw, and the screwdriver's too big. Move the spring, which is for the eject mechanism, or the door, I think. So that's that. And what we can do now is carefully pop the hinges of the cassette door, and that should come out as well. So there's that. There's the top half, there's the bottom half, and all this is now going to go into the bathtub for the mother of all scrubs. So with the cases all out, the backyard drying, I guess it's time to pay some attention to the crunchy keyboard. So let's start disassembling this. Right, we've ended up with a huge pile of dust. This is disgusting, but it's now a single piece, so that can be scrubbed like the cases. The membrane very carefully will get wiped down. We'll wipe that down with some Windex, I think. Let's try and make my workspace at least remotely clean. And grab some paper towel. Let's start by just simply wiping off the big chunks. And I don't want to use anything really more than just Windex on this, and even then just a very light spray, just to clean it. Ew, that's what came off the membrane. Okay, that's the membrane done. Carefully put that to one side. Okay, these keycaps, does this little spring come out? No, good, okay. So all this is going to go for a soak. This and this is going to go for a scrub, and I'll be back momentarily. So now, while all that is drying, let's turn our attention to the main board, which is filthy. Well, actually the underside isn't too bad, but the top side is horrible. And this is going to be a simple case of IPA and a toothbrush. So let's get scrubbing. All right, that is considerably less bad. Okay, so now I've basically got to wait for everything to dry and we can start putting this thing back together. So things are starting to dry. As you can see here, I've got the bottom of the case. We can start putting a few things back together. Now, just so we're clear, this machine is never going to be a showstopper. It's never going to be cosmetically perfect. If we have a look at the bottom, it's covered in scratches. There's a burn mark from somewhere, and I've basically just cleaned it up as best I can. So let's start by getting the motherboard back in. But before we do, you may have noticed this before, this small green wire. So the point of this is actually the 5 volt for the SCART connector. So we can drop that in there and put the screws in. And now we can just solder this wire back to a point just here. Because as you may know, SCART requires, well, I was going to say 5 volt, but 5 volt and I think it's about 2 volt, and you do that with a resistor. And a lot of cables you buy take an external 5 volt power supply. I made my own cable running the 5 volt from there, and it seems to work fine. So that's that bit done. So next we can start putting the top back together, which we will start with this, which just needs a bit of a wipe over. And this should just pop back into here to begin with. And then we just need to pop these hinges back in. Right, and before we forget, we need to put that spring back in, which went there, there, and whoop. Nearly had it. Okay, that way. Oh, it went that way, right. So that went on there. You hook in there, and we'll get the screw on top. Okay, and now we can get the tape deck back in by getting that in, get it sitting roughly in the right place, make sure all our wires are tucked away. You need to go back in there before I forget. Just kind of push it in. Make sure those wires are out of the way. Now we want to start with the power switch because it's got that little earth strap that we need. So and you go in there. Just keep it out of the way for the screw of the volume control. Now the volume control can go back in. Oops, wrong way. Oh, that's right. Like so. Right, now we can start getting the screws for the actual tape deck in place. I'm going to start with this one so I don't forget. And this one with the little twist tie thing goes here. And that's to keep the wires away from the main drive motor and the pulley and everything. So that's the cassette tape back in. Well, I guess there's no time like the present to put the keyboard back together. So I guess it's time to see if this actually still works. And it does. The old GT65 is obviously on the black and white, but all in all, I think it actually turned out really well. I wasn't able to retro-bright some of the coloured keycaps, especially the two enter keys. They're obviously really dull, but it's just too cold out there. It's the middle of winter. And like I said, this is never going to be a showpiece. It's a working computer that I wanted to get clean and preferably have a keyboard that doesn't feel like it's full of sand. But with this bit done, I think it's time to turn our attention to the floppy disk drive. So this here is my FD1 and my DDI, disk drive interface floppy drive. But the drive in this is dead. It was working for a while. I did the belts, it was working, and then the drive motor gave out, which produced a rather interesting smell, but that drive is dead. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to put a Gotek in it. But I want to do this in a way that, should I ever come across another drive and disks, I'm able to swap it all over again. So if we pull the cover off, here is the internals of the floppy drive. And if we remove the actual drive, yes, obviously I've already taken all the screws out. We've got basically, it's essentially a power supply with an LED. The cable comes in the back, it does some funny things, and then it plugs into here. Now this, as you can probably see, there's not enough pins for a normal 34 pin disk drive cable. So we need to do something a little clever. What's going to happen is we're going to carefully pull this out, and we will lift this and the heatsink out and slide the ribbon cable out of the way because there's a slot for it. Lift the power supply out and kind of lift all this out at the same time and just put it to one side. This is the board here that separates off the power. Oh, as a side note, the disk drive interface isn't actually powered by the computer. It's powered by this. So one of the things this cable does is actually send power back to this. Now we're not going to have that anymore, but there's a modification to this we'll do in a minute. We're essentially going to remove this and safely put it to one side with the disk drive, and that can go into storage. And our cable, minus dead bug, is basically going to come straight through underneath all the power supply components and into the disk drive. So we need to start by making a cable. So I'll carefully just kind of plonk that all back in there and shuffle it to one side. And we want to start off with a piece of 35 core ribbon cable. There we go. It's, I don't know, maybe a bit more than 1 meter long. And we're simply just going to use IDC connectors. So what we need to do is get our orientation correct. So this is actually going to go on here because then it flips over with the strain relief. So if we get this here, get that piece and clip it on. Well, and then what we need to do is, I need my eyes, and I want to line this up so it's lined up with the pins inside and push down. And then I would normally do this in the bench vise out in the garage, and I may even resort to that, but for the interim I just want to use a pair of if I can find them, I can usually get away with simply using a pair of multi-grips and carefully squeeze this together bit by bit. Now, if you remember ages ago, I did a similar IDC connector on some Spectrum 2 joystick adapters, and it's basically the same thing, except it's obviously a lot wider. Okay, I'm going to run off to the garage and finish this in the vise so we've got even pressure pushing it together. So I've returned from the garage with my cable made up, but this cable needs some modifications at both ends. We're going to start with the floppy drive end, which is where I've put the strain relief. And we need to actually disconnect a few of these wires. The wires are 33, 31, 29 and 21. And so what I'm going to do is start by marking these out, knowing that we have 34. So we've got 33, 31, 29 and then 21. So counting backwards, 29, 28, 27, 26, 25, 24, 23, 22, 21 is that one there, somewhere in the kind of middle-ish, but not quite. Now, the way I'm going to do this is, now flip it back around, is I'm going to run a sharp knife down either side of the wires that require to be disconnected. Right, it's not the neatest job, but it'll do. And I find, at least, is I then get my knife, hook it under the wire, and simply go pull, and that's that wire separated. And we'll do it with the other three. Separated. Separated, and one more. Separated. And now I can reach from my side cutters, assuming I knew where they were, and neaten this up a bit by simply pulling back the wires like that and clipping them off. Do the same to the top. And we have our modified cable, well, at least one end of it. Now, the other end has less to do with actual electronics and more to do with clearance. Let me explain. Here is our DDI, and if I whip the screws out of it, our biggest problem here is clearance. So this item is not particularly thick in this direction, and it's made less so by the time the circuit board is recessed into the case. And if I tip this out, I've actually already gone and soldered some pins in at the right length when I was actually working out how I was going to do this. But even if I take this connector here and put it on, plug it into the pins very carefully, right, that thickness there is still too thick to put the case on. If I now just simply put the case back on, it sits too proud for, let me get this around the right way, for this to actually, by the time the screws go in, see how it's constantly trying to push a gap? And if I really squeeze it, I could get it, but even then I can feel a lot of pressure in there. So, what are we going to do about it? Well, the only thing we really can do is remove the top cover from this IDC connector. Now, this can be tricky, especially once it's on the board, but I wanted to show you. So I'm either going to end up taking this back off and removing it. Okay, no, we're going to carefully pull this off, and it's a very tight fit. I'm not sure how I managed to get it so tight, but I did. So I'm just going to carefully get a very small screwdriver. Oh, I actually managed to clip it off. Okay, wonder if I can get the other side off. Come on. Aha, right. So maybe that's the trick. Just get a screwdriver underneath it. Right. Carefully remove that. Let's push the connector back down flush on the board. And that actually gives us the height that we need to put this in. If I now put that back on there like that, we can screw that up and it stays all in the right shape. However, that is not a long-term connection. I guarantee you it's only going to take a matter of time before the strain on that is going to pop these wires out of their little pincers, I guess you could call them. So what we're going to do is this. Now, this may not be the neatest job in the world, but if I put down some baking soda and some super glue, you can probably see where this is going. We're going to... Now, this is Loctite Professional Super Glue, and I use this because it's got a slightly more gel consistency as opposed to traditional cheap runny super glue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a bead very carefully over those pins, like so. We don't want it running all over the place, but we want a good amount because we want it to be able to sit either side of the pins, not just down the center. And then I'm going to grab some of this, tip it out so I can get my fingers on it, and basically make a big mess. So we're going to tip some of this onto the back of that connector, push it down to get the baking soda right into the glue. And if we tap that out, we have, and I'm going to give it a blow, we have not the neatest, but a quite secure fitting on the back of that plug, seeing as we had to get rid of the actual black piece of plastic that would normally do that job. So with that, we can actually now put this back together. However, if you remember, I said there was a modification to the DDI that we needed to do. Get some of that out of the way. And that is to rewire this so it actually pulls its 5 volts from the computer and not from the actual disk drive unit. So let me heat up the soldering iron and I'll show you what we need to do. Okay, on the back of the board, all we need to do is run a bodge wire from this point here, which is kind of directly above the I and the K, just here, to this point just here. You'll see this thick trace come through and there's 2 points. We want to solder it from there back to there. And this is really quite simple. So we'll just take a short piece of wire and now kind of trim it to a reasonable length, which will be about that long. Let's, come on, just trim the end of that slightly. Bit of solder. And we can run this down to where we need it to bridge to. Just carefully, come on. That needs to go there. All right, we're good. So with that one simple wire, the DDI will now pull its 5 volt from the machine and not from the disk drive. Okay, so that's the DDI end of it all taken care of. We can put that to one side, but not too far away. Let's turn our attention back to the actual floppy drive unit. So let's just carefully lift all this stuff back out and put it to one side carefully, because we've got old wires connecting to LEDs and stuff. This we want to feed through the gap in the back where the old board was, and we want it, which way do we want it? We want it kind of that way, which is upside down, but that's fine. And we want to feed this carefully through that back. It's a tight squeeze, but it will go. And just lay that in there like that for now. Next, let's start putting all this stuff back in, and you've got to kind of juggle it. I find it easiest to start at the power supply end. Just so you know, the mains cable needs to kind of fit in that gap just here. So we kind of put that in there, and this kind of drops in. It's got a couple of slots that it sits in, and that sits there. We then drop the transformer in. We don't care about that cable anymore, but it can just sit there. And then we want to slide, you can see this slot in this circuit board. We want to slide that up in there. It doesn't quite fit, but it fits enough. And then we want to drop this onto its locating pins in there. So that's all good to go. Next, let's reach for the Gotek, if I can remember where I actually put it. Here it is, it's right next to me. This is going to sit in here like this, so obviously we want to connect our ribbon cable. That's fine. Now, here's something that I learnt the hard way. See this connector here? For all intents and purposes, it looks like a normal floppy drive connector, except the 12 volt is on this side, and the 5 volt is on this side, which is the opposite of a normal floppy drive connector. Yay! So if we just, all I'm going to do for this is take some jumper pins, some jumper cables like this, so male at one end, female at the other. And I'm going to plug these in here, red for positive, black for negative. And then I'm going to plug these onto the back of the Gotek, remembering that 5 volt is the one closest to the ribbon cable. I'll just kind of tuck that all away. And this is pretty much, well, it is ready just to put the cover back on. And we're ready to go. So I'll whip the screws back into this, and then we'll see how it actually is in operation. All right, let's see after all that work if it still works. While I was doing this, I actually got given a 64K RAM expansion. So let's actually stick that in there. What the hell? It goes in between the disk drive interface and the computer, just to add more to it. And switch the disk drive on first, the Gotek. Turn that on, and we're good. And we should get a directory listing. And we do, Prince of Persia. So run prince.bin. And it works. Awesome. Now I can load up that thumb drive with all kinds of games. Let's play some. So there we go, it's all up and running, it's all clean. Like I said, it's never going to be picture perfect. It's got way too many bumps and scrapes from its 30 odd years of life to ever be in that condition. But at least I no longer have a keyboard made of sand. We've got a working Gotek, so I can load up probably the entire library for this computer on a single thumb drive. Actually, I'm sure I can. And the 64K RAM expansion means I can play pretty much anything. So I'm really happy with that. I'm slowly starting to learn the good games for the Amstrad and starting to get into it a little more. And I'm really, really impressed with it, to be honest. If you liked the video, click like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.